Okay, so here we are in the Blender user interface. Hopefully, as a beginning user, you should have had a little bit of time to familiarize yourself with this. Again, this tutorial is not for people who have never used Blender before. It's for people who are semi-familiar and a little bit comfortable and are looking to do their first, project. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of this cube. We can see it selected by the yellow outline. If we hit X and then delete. Okay, so two ways that we can add things. We can either click it right here where it says add, or we can hit Shift A. We'll get the same menu either way, and I'll be going back and forth just to show that over and over again so you know the two ways that you can do it. We need a mesh plane. Right now the mesh plane, if we hit the N menu, by the way, if you hit N while you're in this view, you'll get this side menu, and it'll look this way in object mode. It'll look different in edit mode. The part that I want to talk about is this dimensions. Right now, Blender is set by default in the metric system, which is good. I'm in America, obviously, and we don't use the metric system yet, and I wish we would switch over because it's a way easier system. Anywho, we can see that these grid squares are 1 meter apiece, so our object's dimensions are 2 meters by 2 meters, and then you can see it's 0 on the Z. And that's because technically this object has no thickness. All right, so you can always click this on by hitting N or hit N to get rid of it. All right, so let's make this plane a little bit bigger. I'm going to scale it up by 10. So all we do is we hover our mouse off to the side. By the way, whenever we do any kind of a transformation on our object, we're going to get this dotted line that appears. That's part of our control system. And if we hover our mouse right over the object when we scale, we won't have very much room to maneuver. So it's a good practice to always put your mouse kind of over to the side. So the command we want is S for scale, and then a 10 on the top of our keyboard, and then we have to left click to end that process. Okay, so that scales up our plane by 10, and that's what we want. Second thing we want to do here is we want to change the position of our camera. If I left click the camera, you will see that I select it. We know it's selected by the fact that it's yellow. All right, if we're going to have to use our numpad in order to see from various directions. If you don't have a numpad on your computer, real quick, you can come right up here to Edit, Preferences, Input, and then right here you see Emulate Numpad. This will allow you to use the top numbers on your keyboard as your numpad. Also, there's Emulate 3-button mouse. If you don't have a 3-button mouse, you can emulate it right here. I would suggest that you get a numpad computer or a keyboard, and then also a 3-button mouse if you want to progress. It really is kind of necessary, and they're really not very expensive. All right, so let's click the X to get rid of that. All right, so to move our camera or move any objects within Blender, you're probably hopefully familiar enough with it that I can use G to move things, or I can use the Gizmo. First method is let's hit 7 on our numpad. That'll give us top view. My camera's selected, and we know it is because it's yellow. I can hit G and then X, and that'll constrain its movement only to the X-axis. I want to move it over here in alignment with this green line, which is the Y-axis. Real quick, hopefully we're all aware of what axes are and how to use them within Blender. As we look at our scene from the top down, this line here is our X-axis, the red one. The green one is the Y-axis, and then up and down is the Z-axis. Okay, I'm going to hit 7 again into our numpad. And by the way, I have a new gaming mouse that's scroll wheel, super sensitive. I'm going to have to look into desensitizing it somehow through their software, I guess. All right, so another thing we can look at as kind of a cheat sheet is we can see the it's not really called a gizmo, but you can see that it has a green, a red, and a blue, and it tells you Y, X, and Z in relationship. So if you forget what color the lines are or any of that kind of stuff, you can always use this cheat sheet. Now, another thing about this gizmo up here that's kind of interesting is if you're on a laptop or some kind of computer that doesn't have a mouse per se, you can actually left click on, say, this X, and then move it around by left clicking and holding, and then moving it would probably be on your trackpad or something like that. It's kind of an interesting way to move. I prefer to just do it the old-fashioned way. All right, so let's hit 7 on our numpad again, get in a top view. All right, cool. So that's enough about the axes. Hopefully you kind of figured that out. And just a good piece of advice, when we're building things in Blender, we want to keep things as in alignment with the center of the world origin, which is indicated by this candy cane looking thing, which is the 3D cursor. Right now, by default, it's set in the center, which is pretty much where we want it for this entire process. We can move it around by clicking this icon, and then that'll allow us to use our left click to place it where we want. I'm adding this little chunk in here, so it'll be a little bit of an edit. In case you did hit this button here, and now if I left click it, now every time we left click somewhere, we can't get rid of this 3D cursor. It just goes everywhere. Okay, well, and that's very important for later on in other projects, but for right now, it's not important. So if that happened to you and you're kind of stuck, that's what this is for. So the way we fix that is we simply hit the Shift S and hold that down. I don't think you had to hold it down in previous versions, or at least for some reason today, I'm having to hold it down. But then we go to this one right here, option 1, cursor to world origin. And when we let go, it's going to be back in the center. And then if we come over here and hit our gizmo, then we will get our gizmo back. Now, if the plane wasn't selected and you hit this right here and you didn't get your gizmo, it's simply because the plane wasn't selected. So select the plane again. All right, hopefully that's enough of that. So if you get lost with your 3D cursor for some reason, just remember Shift S is the way out. All right, so now we've determined that I can hit G and then one of the axes, X, that's how I moved this over. The second way I can move my camera around is by hitting this icon in this left control panel. You can see it says move. If I click it, you'll see that now I have this thing called a gizmo attached to the camera. I can actually grab onto the fat part of the arrow by left clicking and holding and then moving my mouse, and it'll also move the camera and constrain it only to the axes that we want, which is kind of cool. Now, sometimes this gizmo is going to get in your way, so if you want to turn it off, you can turn it off here, and then you can click it again to turn it on. All right, so I'm going to push my middle mouse button down, break out of the top view, and then I want to end the rotation or cancel the rotation that's on the camera by default. And the way we do that is we hit Alt-R, and you'll see that it points straight down. Now, in order for it to look forward along the y-axis, I want to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. So that looks like this, R, X, 9, 0, and then I have to hit left-click to end that process. And now we can see our camera's looking straight down the y-axis. Now, I'm going to grab the blue arrow right here, left-click and hold, and lower the camera down. Now, in order to see what the camera sees, it's 0 on the numpad. Now we're in camera view, and we can see that we have this big yellow box, a rectangular box. That indicates what the camera sees. Everything in the box is going to be in our image or video at the end. Everything outside the box will not be rendered. So that's a pretty easy concept. Okay, so if I select the plane by left-clicking anywhere over here, excuse me, we can see that I can now have the plane selected. I want to actually bring my camera down a little bit. So sorry, we should have just left our camera selected. And then if we Z, grab it and move it on the Z, we can bring it down just a little bit. We want the horizon line here to be about 1/3 of the way up. Okay, so now let's select our plane. And then we need to give our plane more geometry so that it has places to bend so we can see bumps where there would be a snowy, snow drifts in a snowy field. In order to do that, we have to go into edit mode. 2 ways to go into edit mode. One is to come right up here where it says object mode, click it, and then hit this edit mode. And now we'll be in edit mode. You can actually see vertices, edges, and faces now. And right up here, you can see we're in vertex mode. Now this is vertex mode, edge mode, face mode. The shortcut keys for these are 1 for vertex mode on the top of your keyboard, 2 for edge mode, 3 for face mode. I'll tell you about that here coming up, and I'll switch back and forth so we get comfortable using both ways. All right, while we're in edit mode, we can add extra geometry by subdividing this. Real quick though, the second way to go into edit mode and object mode is to use the shortcut key, which is the tab key. Tab simply toggles us into object mode. Tab takes us back into edit mode. It'll take us back and forth. It's the quick way to do it. It's the preferred way for me. Object mode and edit mode are the two main modes you'll work in, and so tab's really the way to go. All right, so when we want to subdivide this, once we have the entire object selected, and by the way, if I hit Alt-A, it'll deselect everything on my object while we're in edit mode. And then if I hit A, it'll select everything. So for this to work, we need everything selected. So please hit the A key. All right, and now we're going to right click, and then we're going to hit Subdivide. You can see that it chopped it into 4 pieces. If we come right down here to the left, there's this Subdivide menu. If we click it, we'll get a bunch of more options. The one we want is number of cuts. We're going to hover over the number, left click, then we're going to backspace. And then we're going to hit in number 60, and then we have to hit enter, obviously. And you can see that it chopped it into a bunch of pieces. So that's what we want. All right, if we hit tab to go into object mode, now we can come over here to this. And by the way, you could add modifiers in edit mode as well. But let's go right over here to this wrench. The wrench in this control panel indicates modifiers. And the reason for that is because modifiers are going to do work for us. And that's really enough said. They take repetitive processes and make them very easy for us. So if we click it, we'll get the option to add a modifier. And then we're going to come down here to the one that says displace. So let's left click displace. And we'll see that our plane has jumped up and our scene doesn't look like it did before at all. And that may seem like a mistake, but it's not. So don't worry about it right now. So then what we have to do is we have to give this plane a texture, kind of for the computer to use a map to say where the highs and lows are. The way we do that is we come in the same control panel down at the bottom. This checkerboard one, as you can see if you hover over it, is the texture properties. If we left click it, it'll give the option to add a new texture. If we come right here where it says type, we're going to click image or movie. We're going to come right down here to the one that says clouds. Okay, so now basically what's happening is we've assigned this black and white texture that has black, white, and gray, and it's basically telling the computer that wherever it's black, it's going to be low. Wherever it's white, it's going to be high, and the grays are going to be somewhere in between. So all we did really was tell the computer in a simple black and white language how to make this terrain look. Okay, and so we need to lessen this just a little bit because trying to put a snowman in here is probably not going to work out. The way we do that is we have to go back to the modifiers tab, which again, modifiers do work. That's why it's the wrench. We're going to come right over here to this one called strength. If we hover over the number, and then before we left click, we're going to hold down the shift key, and this will allow us to move it very slowly. So now I'm going to hold down the shift key, left click, move my mouse to the left, and we'll see that we get nice, easy control. Now, I want to be somewhere like this, probably. I'm at 0.170, and we can see that our field is kind of bumpy. There's some snow drifts out there, and it's looking pretty good. Now, we can see that it's kind of patchy, and that's because we're still technically kind of low polygon count. Now, if we look down here, we can see we have 3,844 vertices. And that's pretty low poly. That's why we see all these faceted squares. So let's add a little more geometry by adding another modifier. If we come over to the wrench, make sure it's selected, we'll have this option at the very top to left click. And this time we're going to add subdivision surface, 3 up from the bottom in the generate column. If we click it, we'll see it smooths out immediately. We'll also see down here that now we're up to 15,000 vertices. And if we come into this control panel now, that's in our now what's called a modifier stack, we can click this view. If we click it to 2, we'll see that jumps us up to 60,000 vertices. Now, the more vertices and faces there are, the harder the computer has to work in order to figure out where everything is. So I'm going to come back to this viewport one, this little arrow to the left of viewport. If we click it, make sure that viewport says 1. We'll be sitting somewhere around 15,000 vertices. Okay. Real quickly, this modifier stack. I can add as many modifiers as we want, and when we add them all, they stack up in order. Now, in this instance, it works and does just what I want, but sometimes when you add a bunch of modifiers in here, it will do something that's not predictable or isn't what you wanted. In that case, sometimes what it is that these modifiers are not in the correct order to be operating the way you want them to be. If that's the case, you can check it out and try to troubleshoot it by hitting these arrows. These will take it up or down within the modifier stack. So that's how you can change the position, and sometimes that'll fix a problem you have. For now, this is perfect, and we'll just leave it like this. If we hover in this area out here, right-click and shade smooth. Now, by the way, we'll only get that shade smooth option if we're in object mode. It will not appear as a right click in edit mode. Now we can see that our snow is looking pretty good. It's smoothed out, it's looking a little bit better. So real quick, let's give it a material. Before we give it a material though, let's move our light. I'm gonna left click the light, and then I'm gonna drag it kind of over here. And then let's go into rendered mode. So right now we're in solid view. This is good for modeling, but if we want to see what our picture actually looks like, we're going to have to change the view. 2 ways to change the view. Right up here on the top, we get these globe looking things. The one all the way to the right, if we click it, it's going to take us into rendered mode and show us what our photo looks like. Another way to go into rendered mode is to hit the Z key. And sometimes you gotta hold it down for some reason. And then you can see that we have options rendered, solid, and then material preview and wireframe. Wireframe's pretty handy for some things. I'm not sure if we go into it in this tutorial, but wireframe's a very handy mode. Okay, and it looks like it picked it for us. So I'm gonna go back with Z key and hit rendered. Okay, so Z key, you can choose rendered, or you can come right up here. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Now, when the light is selected, which it is, it's yellow, now I'll get this icon down here, this green light bulb. If I click it, now we see the controls for the light. In this scene, what we want is a sun lamp, so I'm going to click it. And we'll see that it washes out because for some reason in these versions of Blender, the sun lamp is very, very strong, set way too strong. So if we hover over the number, left click, backspace, and then hit 2.5, enter, we'll get a much better light, sunlight. Okay, now what I want to do is grab the blue arrow, bring it down just a little bit, and then this ray coming out of it basically indicates the angle. And so we want to rotate that so that it's looking at this lower left corner. The way we do that is we can just hover our mouse down here anywhere. We're going to hit R, and we're just going to move our mouse however we have to point it kind of towards the bottom there. Okay. Now I also want the light to come kind of from the front a little bit, so let's change our view by hitting 7 on the numpad. And we can see that our light is in fact angled across, but it's coming more towards from back to front. Let's move using the green arrow, move this just a little bit forward. And while we're looking straight down, all we have to do again is hit R, and let's make it come towards the center of the scene. You can see it's crisscrossing our 3D cursor. Now if we hit 0 on the numpad, we'll go back into our camera view, and this is what it looks like so far. So it's looking pretty good. All right, so now let's give the ground a material. In order to do so, we have to left click so that it turns yellow and we know it's selected. And we can come up here to this new cool area that Blender 2.8 has, which is these instant workstations. They're all preset. They're pretty handy. The one we would want is this shading one. However, I like it, but at the same time, it's very complex. It has a lot of windows and a lot of stuff going on. We just don't need that for this scene. So an easier way to do it is to come over here next to the word options. If we go to the right of it, right up in this corner here, we'll get this plus sign. If I left click and hold and then move my mouse to the left, we'll see I open a new window. Now I want this area to be called a shader editor, so we can pick our type of editor right here in the upper left. And by the way, this is what the icon looks like right now, but if I left click it, you can see that each editor has its own icon, so this will actually change, and I'll show you what I mean. If we pick the one we want, which is shader editor, left click, you'll see that the icon changed. Just remember that in the upper left, in this header, in any window you open, that's always going to be how you pick the shader editor. All right, so now we're in the shader editor, and we have this N menu open. If I hover over here, you can see in any window, if I push the N key, I'll get this menu. This is what the menu looks like in object mode. it'll look different in edit mode. And if I hit N, I can get rid of it. This is what it looks like in this shader editor by default, and it's in here on by default. So if I just hit N, it'll go away. Okay, so with our ground selected, we can come up here and hit New, and that'll give us a new material. Let's get in a good habit of naming things. Right here where it says material 0.001, if I left click and then backspace, we can just name it ground. And then we have to hit enter for it to accept it, and now it's named ground. Okay. All right, so let's come in here real quick, and this is the material. And we can also name this plane over here, because we're only naming the material. But in our editor over here, or I'm sorry, our organizer for our collections, it's still calling it plane. So if you want to, you can double click right here, and then we can hit backspace, and then we can put ground again. And now it's naming that object ground. Remember, we have to hit, I'm sorry, I'm misspelling things here. All right, and then we have to hit enter to make it accept it. So now it's named ground. So now the object's named ground, and then our material is also named ground. And you don't have to do that. If you only have a few things in your scene, you really don't even need to name stuff. But the more things you add, the easier it will be to keep it organized. Okay, cool. So now we have the ground. We want to add a material. So the first thing that I want to do is, as over here, we can add things in this window with this add. We can also add it right here. So if we click add, I'm going to add a input ambient occlusion. And we're going to pull this right over here because we need a little bit of space right here for another node. And then other node, the other way we can add nodes is to just hit Shift A. And then we're going to add in a converter color ramp. So I'm going to left click and put that there. One thing you may notice is if these are too close together, you'll have a hard time connecting these connectors. So I'm going to just give myself a little bit of room. Okay, so let's go color to this factor on the color ramp. And then let me get in just a little closer here. And then we'll go color to base color. Okay. Now a couple things we want to turn on in the Eevee render engine real quick. And again, this control panel is super important. This is where a lot of stuff is. Right here, this one that looks like the back of a digital camera, if I left click it, I'll get all the controls for the Eevee render engine. And we want to turn on a couple of these things real quick. One is we need to put a checkbox in ambient occlusion. We need to put one in screen space reflections. And then right down here where it says shadows, if we left click, we'll see by default now soft shadows is on. Make sure there's a check in that box. It should be by default. And then we want this other one high bit depth. So let's just left click that. All right. And now to tidy these up, we can always just click this arrow and that'll get rid of it. Okay, cool. So ambient occlusion was the one we just added with this part of our texture, our material. And we'll get to that later. We're not going to mess with it right now because it's not super important, but we just wanted to add it to our material. Another thing we want to add to this material is a little bit of bumpiness. Now we've created the big bumps with our displace modifier, so let's create some little bumps. We're going to go texture, noise texture, and we're going to want two of these. So the fast way is to Shift D and then left click and drop it. If we're going to hit Shift A again, and this time we're going to go vector bump, and we're going to need another one of these as well. So Shift D to duplicate. And then right here, we're going to need a mix, color mix RGB. So Shift A, color mix RGB. We'll drop that right there. If we get in a little bit closer, we're going to take color to height on these bumps. Color to height, and then we can mix these normals into color 1 and color 2. Now it doesn't matter which one of these goes in here. It won't matter at all in this application. Sometimes it does matter, so if you're having a weird problem, maybe just try switching these around. Again, not in this context, but in other parts of other projects, that may be a problem. And then here we go color to normal. Okay, and then now we didn't really see much happen over here. And that's because the scale of our noise textures, they're both exactly the same, and the scale is pretty big right now. So if I hover over the number, left click, move my mouse to the right, we'll see we start getting some bumpiness. So let's take this up to 40 or 50, in there somewhere. The bottom one here, we're going to make these bumps not quite as small as these. And by the way, you may have noticed that as the number on the scale gets bigger, the actual texture gets smaller. Okay, so it's kind of a counterintuitive at first when you're first using it. All right, on this bottom one, if we left click, again, left click and hold, move my mouse to the right. Let's put it in the 14 or 15 zone, maybe 16. Okay, and then right now this is too powerful, so the way we control that is we move over to the bump node, and then this one that says strength, I left click and hover over the number, left click, move it to the left. The further to the left I move it, the less strength it has. Let's put it to say 0.1, and then let's come down to this bottom one and do the same thing, and let's move it down to say right around 0.2 or so. Okay, that gives us pretty cool looking snow. However, unfortunately, later as we apply the modifiers on this snowy field, the texture is going to change slightly, so we're going to have to adjust that a little bit towards the end. So we're not going to worry about that very much. Okay, so in summary, we've added a plane, we added a displacement modifier to get the bumps, we added a subdivision surface modifier in order to smooth it out, we've added 2 noise textures to get some smaller bump texture, and then we changed the light. The lighting, we changed it to a sun lamp, as you recall. Sorry, my mouse is kind of crazy. All right, so we've changed it to sun, and remember, you only get that icon when you select the light. And then we changed the color slightly. We changed the strength down to 2.5. Things are looking way better in this scene. I'm going to go back to 0 in our on our numpad. Okay, and so I think that's where we're going to leave this first segment. So I will see you in the next segment.